There are moments in life when the silence becomes deafening. Not just the absence of noise, but the kind of silence that wraps around your spirit like fog. Soft, cold, inescapable. You sit in a quiet room surrounded by your thoughts and realize how loud the emptiness truly is. This is the ache of loneliness. Not just being alone, but feeling unseen, untouched, unheld by the world. It's one of the deepest human pains. And yet, hidden within it is something sacred. C.S. Lewis once wrote, "We live, in fact, in a world starved for solitude, silence, and privacy, and therefore starved for meditation and true friendship." To Lewis, loneliness wasn't merely a symptom of human frailty. It was an invitation, a door into the deeper life. In our modern age, loneliness is treated like a disease, something to cure, fix, avoid. But the soul knows otherwise. The soul knows that solitude is where transformation begins. That silence is not emptiness, but space. And that space, when entered with reverence, can become holy ground. Lewis didn't discover this truth in comfort. He discovered it in grief. When he lost the woman he loved, he entered a silence so profound it shook his faith. In A Grief Observed, he writes with brutal honesty about the spiritual abandonment he felt. He knocked on the door of heaven and heard nothing but the sound of bolts sliding shut. And yet, he did not turn away. He stayed. He waited. He listened. And in time, the silence itself began to speak. His is the gift of loneliness. It strips away the noise, the distractions, the masks. It leaves you face to face with yourself. And in that raw honesty, something sacred happens. You begin to hear the quiet voice of God, not as thunder, but as stillness. Not as answers, but as presence. Loneliness teaches you what cannot be taught in crowds, how to sit with pain without fixing it, how to befriend yourself in your most vulnerable state, how to open your soul to a love that does not depend on being seen by others. The Desert Fathers, the ancient Christian mystics, understood this. They withdrew from the noise of the world, not because they hated people, but because they sought communion with what is eternal. In their silence, they found clarity. In their solitude, they found intimacy with the divine. Lewis, too, discovered that the ache of aloneness was not a curse, but a calling, a path that few choose, but one that leads to the core of who we are. The loneliness you feel is not proof that something is wrong with you. It may be a sign that your soul is longing for depth, for truth, for God. And that longing will not be satisfied with distractions. It will not be comforted by noise. It waits for the silence. In the next part, we will explore how this silence, though painful, is not empty, but full of presence. How it can become the birthplace of meaning, and how Lewis's own experience of divine absence became the foundation for deeper faith. There is a silence that wounds, and a silence that heals. At first, they feel the same. When you're alone in your thoughts, when prayers feel like whispers into a void, when your phone doesn't light up, when you lie awake and feel the weight of your own existence pressing on your chest, this silence can feel unbearable. It triggers all the voices within you that say you're forgotten, unworthy, broken. But what if the silence isn't rejection? What if it's invitation? C.S. Lewis discovered this painfully. After the loss of his wife, Joy, he wrote in his journal, "Where is God? Go to him when your need is desperate, when all other help is vain. And what do you find? A door slammed in your face." It would have been easy to stop there, to take the silence as abandonment. But Lewis didn't. He kept walking deeper into the stillness. And what he found wasn't a cruel God, but a silent one. And silence, as he began to learn, is not the same as absence. It's mystery, it's space. It's the way love sometimes lets go of words so that something greater can emerge. We often want answers. God often gives presence, not in the way we expect, rarely in thunder, more often in whisper. But for those who wait in the silence long enough, something starts to shift. The silence begins to echo, not with noise, but with meaning. You start to notice things, the way the light moves through the room, the sound of your breath, the depth of your own longing. You begin to realize that you are not alone. You are being stripped of illusions. Loneliness has a way of removing everything that isn't essential. You're left with you, and if you stay there long enough, you begin to meet someone you've never fully known. Yourself, unmasked. And beyond that, the God who dwells not in noise but in stillness. The mystics called this the dark night of the soul, a time when the old ways of feeling God no longer work, when comfort vanishes and faith becomes a dry desert. But they also knew something we often forget. That darkness is not death, it's gestation. Something is being born in the silence. C.S. Lewis wrote later in A Grief Observed that the silence of God began to change. Not because God had finally spoken in loud words, but because Lewis had become quiet enough to hear. He said, "It is not the locked door. It is more like a silent, certainly not uncompassionate gaze, as though he shook his head not in refusal but in waving the question like, 'Peace, child, you don't understand.' This is the beginning of a new kind of intimacy, one that doesn't depend on emotion or signs or the approval of others. It's the kind of faith that is no longer held up by feelings, but by surrender. A quiet knowing that the silence has meaning, that God may be hidden, but not gone, that your loneliness is not wasted. It is preparation. When you stop resisting the silence, it starts to become sacred. You begin to see loneliness not as punishment, but as purification, not as evidence that no one cares, but as the space where you are being made new. And in that transformation you start to hear again, not with your ears, but with your soul. In the next part, we'll explore how to walk through loneliness with reverence instead of fear, and how to let this sacred silence reshape your view of yourself, of others, and of God. Loneliness, when embraced with reverence, becomes a teacher. It doesn't only reveal what is missing, it reveals what is eternal. And this is where most people turn back, because the silence doesn't reward you immediately. It doesn't comfort you with noise or distraction. It offers something subtler, deeper, slower: transformation. The sacred path of loneliness is one of shedding. You begin to notice how much of your identity was built on being seen, how much of your energy was spent trying to be heard, understood, admired. Loneliness takes all of that away, not to punish, but to purify. You are invited to ask the question, who am I when no one is looking? And what if that quiet, unseen version of you is the most real? C.S. Lewis, a man of public thought and private pain, came to see that solitude was not merely something to endure, it was something to receive. In the solitude of grief, he began to write not from his intellect but from his soul. His sharp theology softened into honesty. His arguments gave way to awe. He stopped trying to explain God and started seeking him, and the seeking changed him. This is what the silence does. It reorients you. It breaks the habits of performance. It confronts your false attachments, your need to be impressive, productive, validated. In their place, it offers stillness, slowness, attention. These are not easy gifts to receive. We've been trained to avoid them. Our culture tells us to run from loneliness, to fill the space with screens, noise, and movement. But the soul knows something else. It knows that stillness is the womb of wisdom, that silence is the language of God, and that in your loneliness, you are being prepared, not for punishment, but for purpose. The path of loneliness teaches you how to be with yourself, to sit in discomfort without panicking, to hold your wounds without numbing, to listen for God even when He seems absent. And eventually, that practice of presence becomes strength. You begin to carry your solitude not as a burden, but as a blessing. It teaches you how to love without needing to be needed, how to speak from truth instead of fear, how to live rooted in something unshakable. Lewis wrote that love is the only thing worth the risk of pain, and loneliness, when walked with courage, teaches you how to love without illusion. You learn to love others not for how they fill your emptiness, but for who they truly are. You learn to love God not for what He gives, but for who He is, even when silent. And you begin to love yourself, not the polished version, but the real one. This is how loneliness transforms you, not by changing your circumstances, but by changing your center. In the next part, we'll explore how to carry this solitude into your daily life, and how even in the company of others, the sacred stillness you've discovered can remain. The purpose of solitude is not to make you solitary forever, it's to awaken a stillness you can carry with you, into crowds, into relationships, into noise. Loneliness, when embraced as sacred, becomes the soil in which a deeper life takes root. It's not a place to remain forever. It's a place to return to inwardly, even when surrounded by people. The silence you once feared becomes the sanctuary you protect. The stillness you discovered alone becomes the compass that guides you in chaos. When you live from stillness, you begin to move differently. You listen more than you speak. You notice beauty in the small and the ordinary. You're no longer rushing through life as if it's something to conquer, but receiving it as something to behold. People feel safer around you, not because you have all the answers, but because your soul isn't noisy. You've made peace with the quiet. This is one of the quiet miracles of a transformed heart. It becomes a resting place, not only for yourself, but for others. C.S. Lewis, after walking through the silence of grief, emerged with a kind of clarity. He still felt pain, but it was no longer pointless. He still missed his beloved, but the loss had become part of his worship, not a fracture in his faith, but a doorway. He had learned that God's silence is not always absence. Sometimes it is an invitation to trust without proof, to love without reward, to believe without certainty. And those who walk that path become radiant, not with loud confidence, but with quiet strength. Living from stillness does not mean you avoid people or responsibilities. It means you no longer look to them to fill the ache only God can touch. You show up with presence, not performance. You serve from fullness, not from need. You listen to others, not to fix them, but to honor them. This way of living feels strange in a world addicted to urgency, but it is the only way to remain whole, to remain honest, to remain rooted. Every day the world will pull at you. It will beg you to rush, to compare, to speak louder, to be seen, but you've walked through the silence, you've met yourself there, you've met God there. And now you know, your worth was never in what others saw, it was in the stillness you carry, the sacred place within you where loneliness became love. In the final part, we'll explore what it means to no longer fear being alone, and how the soul that has passed through the silence becomes a light in the darkness for others. There comes a moment when the silence no longer scares you, when being alone no longer feels like exile, but like home. Not because the ache has vanished, but because you've stopped running from it. You've learned to sit with it, breathe through it, and let it speak. And in doing so, something in you has changed. You are no longer afraid of the dark because you've discovered the light within it. This is the quiet strength of those who have walked through loneliness with open eyes. They carry something the world cannot give and cannot take away. Not bravado, not performance, but presence. A kind of groundedness that says, I have met pain, and I am still here. I have felt abandoned, and I have not lost faith. I have walked through silence, and I have found meaning. C.S. Lewis once wrote, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our consciences, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. The pain of loneliness is not random. It's a portal. It wakes you up. It asks you to go deeper, to reach for something eternal, to realize that even in the absence of others, you are not without love. For those who have heard the silence and stayed long enough, something holy happens. Loneliness becomes communion. You begin to feel connected, not in the shallow ways the world offers, but in the quiet, sacred ways that root you. You become connected to your own soul, no longer estranged from yourself. You become connected to others, not needing them to fix your pain, but inviting them into it with gentleness. And most of all, you become connected to the divine, not always in words, but in presence, not always in clarity, but in trust. This is why loneliness, when embraced, does not leave you empty. It leaves you expanded. It turns wounds into wisdom. It makes space in your soul for something larger than fear, something truer than noise, something deeper than comfort, something eternal. You become a light, not because you never felt the dark, but because you walked through it with open hands. You become a voice of peace, not because life was easy, but because you learned to sit in the silence and listen. You become love, not the kind that grasps, but the kind that gives. This is the gift of loneliness. It leads you home, not to the place you expected, but to the place your soul has always known, to stillness, to truth, to God. And once you've found that, you are never truly alone again.